the Capital Forum's interview series. My name is Sally Hubbard, and we are delighted to have Paul Denis here with us today. As background, Paul is a partner and deputy chair of the global litigation practice at Dechert, where he focuses on mergers and other business combinations under antitrust scrutiny. Previously, Paul served in the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, where he was the principal draftsman of the U.S.'s 1992 Horizontal Merger Guidelines, which are the foundation for merger guidelines around the world. Paul, thanks so much for joining us today, and let's dive right in.
Pleasure to be here.
So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is the shift in the way the agencies are analyzing mergers to focus more on competitive effects storytelling than on market shares. How have you seen that play out in your practice?
This has been a long time in the making. If you go back to even the Reagan years, it was really the start of it when Bill Baxter came in, revolutionized merger guidelines in 1982. And what's followed since then, the 84 guidelines, the 92 guidelines that I worked on, and even the current 2010 guidelines have moved the agencies away from simple numerical type analysis more toward telling a story. And the reason that became important is that they were losing cases when they focused just on numbers. The defense was almost a laydown. The government would come in with a set of numbers. The defense would come in with business executives who looked like the judge's neighbors and who could actually explain how the business worked. So the government has been moving in the direction of telling a better story and has had better luck in court as a result.
And you represented Medco in the Medco Express Scripts merger, correct?
I did.
And in allowing that merger to proceed, the rationale by the agency was of focusing on competitive effects, not on, despite the high market shares, right?
Very much a competitive effects focused inquiry. The FTC has actually published some serious academic literature coming out of that, where they detailed the kind of work that they did in response to things that we had suggested to them as to why they should clear the deal. But all focused on, will there be an adverse effect on prices without going through the process of defining market? We focused them on looking at actual competitive interactions. Who's bidding for what business? Who's winning what business? What is the actual constraint on firms today, and what will it be tomorrow? You could have posited a host of potential markets, and to some extent they were data mining their way back into a market definition. But the focus was really on price and really on what will be the effect. And that's why the deal got cleared.
And this is different from, other deals where there were comparable market shares, where the agencies were more aggressive. So do you think that this is, I know you said it's been happening over a long time, but is it something that's more becoming even more of an emphasis in recent years?
I think there is more of an emphasis in recent years on competitive effects. And part of it is there's an odd reaction to the losses where the government started to move away from market definition because it was a cause of defeat in court. So the 2010 guidelines, I think, were built around trying to preserve litigation wins and to tell the courts, we don't have to go through this hoop called market definition first, because what was happening is they were losing cases when they had to define a market, and the defense got good at picking holes in the technical aspects of market definition. So they said, we don't want to do that anymore. We want to skip that stage and go to a stage where we think we're stronger. So that really motivated them to go in the direction of competitive effects. But from a defense perspective, ultimately that's what it's all about, is what's going to be the effect of the merger. So we're happy to have the government there talking about competitive effects. I think they still need to prove a market if they're going to go to court. But for an investigation where you're working, back and forth with the agencies, we don't spend much time talking about markets anymore. It's just not an issue.
So you brought up the point that you still have to prove a market if you go to court, and that's something else I wanted to talk to you about. Is should the courts be moving more in the direction of the merger guidelines, and how does the merger guidelines interact with the precedent that's out there?
Well, the merger guidelines did not give up on market definition, right? They engrafted a bunch of language in front of market definition if you're walking sequentially through the guidelines, but they know they still have to define a market. In fact, they have essentially preserved the old framework and just bolted on a discussion up front about affected customer groups and their concern about targeted price discrimination, essentially. So they do still have to prove a market, and I think the courts should force them to do so, because market definition is a really important discipline on these cases. If you don't define a market and you jump straight to competitive effects, you have no way to scale the effects. Right? You end up with trivial cases, essentially. But market definition focuses you on, is there a substantial effect here that's worth bringing out the armada of federal government or state government enforcement against the deal? We need to think about market share, market definition, the structural evidence a little bit differently. So historically, you had this notion that there's a presumption of adverse effects that could be drawn from high market share, high concentration, and a large change in concentration from a deal. Right, so the direction was pushing you toward a case. And then the question was, could you rebut this presumption or overcome this presumption somehow, whatever that meant? Where market share and structural evidence is today, it's a screen. Okay? And I think the best way to think of it is, can we get past this screen? If we can, we're going to do a detailed dive into competitive effects. If we can't get past this screen because we've defined a market where the shares of the emerging firms are really small, we should stop. Right? There's not going to be a substantial effect. It's not worth spending any more time on. Let's take those resources and put them to more productive use.
And that's interesting. And what role do you think that internal company documents should have on the competitive effects analysis? We've seen that a lot of recent mergers have really focused on the internal company documents and the complaints that were filed, like in H&R Block and AT&T, AB InBev. Do you think that's an appropriate focus for the competitive effects analysis?
I do. I think both the government and most people who are defending transactions would agree that internal company documents are important to the analysis. What I would say is you need to use them in a holistic way to show how the business is actually run. Right? These market realities, I think, are really important to competitive effects analysis. What we've seen in a number of cases, though, is there's a tendency to go for the gotcha document, the bad document, the hot document that has some outrageously inflammatory language, right? And the government has actually done badly when they've gotten a little bit too focused on hot documents. I tried the Whole Foods case a few years back, very much a hot documents case, because there were a couple of really inflammatory documents that the government made as their cornerstone of their case. They forgot the rest of the documents in the company. We used the documents more than they did and won with them. So I think we all agree the documents are important. It's a question of selection and how you pick out the ones you're going to use and what's relevant.
Okay, let's turn to the potential competition doctrine and how it factors into merger analysis. Why do you think that the potential competition doctrine has kind of fallen out of favor, or what role do you think it should play?
Well, potential competition doctrine has fallen out of favor because the government couldn't win any potential competition cases. I mean, the courts were very skeptical of the cases that the government was bringing. And after losing on a regular basis, the agencies have backed off of trying cases under the potential competition doctrine and have come up with new angles to go after essentially the same thing.
For our viewers, let's start by actually explain your understanding of what the potential competition doctrine is.
So the potential competition doctrine is about focusing on a loss of competition that has not yet happened, but might happen in the future. Right? So typical horizontal merger analysis, you have two firms merging who are competitors. There's historical competition between them. We can observe that. And we can make some inferences about what's going to happen in the future once that's gone. Okay? That's a little bit speculative. We all know that's a little bit speculative. The Supreme Court has told us it's okay to be a little bit speculative about this. But potential competition takes it out to another level. It says, we haven't observed competition between these firms yet. We think for some reason that there's going to be competition between them in the future. And we're afraid that whatever the future looks like will be worse off because it won't happen. Double speculation, if you will. And that's why the courts raised the bar on the government. They said, if you're going to ask us to shine our crystal ball that well that we can see all of those future events and call them correctly, we're going to put a lot of fairly serious restrictions on you for the cases that were willing to do that in. And that's why the government lost a bunch of cases, because the court set the bar pretty high and they couldn't get over it.
And at what point should the potential competition doctrine kick in? I mean, sometimes I think it might be tricky to figure out what is the difference between actual competition and potential competition. You know, for instance, if there's a product that's being developed in R&D, would that count as potential competition, or would that count as actual competition?
Yeah, I think we can do away with the distinction, and I think
Okay.
we did in the 92 guidelines. So we introduced the concept of uncommitted entry in the 92 guidelines as a contrast to committed entry. An uncommitted entrant is somebody who is a potential entrant. They're not there yet, but they are close enough to be counted as a market participant. So where I think we need to go with this is there needs to be a little bit of symmetry. Okay, we should recognize potential competition as a defense. You know, the prospect of new firms getting into the market is something that has long been recognized by the Supreme Court as an appropriate area of inquiry and merger analysis. Government's got very skeptical about that. They really don't want to hear stories about dynamic response anymore, but they want to tell stories about how things that haven't happened yet might happen in the future, and they want to protect those things from happening. If we could get some symmetry here, I think we should recognize potential competition both through a serious analysis of uncommitted entrants and committed entrants. And if we've got a merging firm that's not currently competing but does qualify as an uncommitted entrant, we should treat that like a horizontal merger. Right? But at the same token, if there are other firms outside of the market who are uncommitted entrants, we should count them as well.
So I'm trying to understand the difference between an uncommitted entrant, like where the line is drawn with an uncommitted entrant and a committed entrant. So, for example, in the Google AdMob merger, the agencies looked at the fact that Apple was going to enter the market for mobile advertising, and so they let Google acquire AdMob. That's a committed entrant, so that's not the same thing as a potential doctrine?
I think, I don't know what the agencies would say. I think they were treating Apple essentially as an uncommitted entrant, because the line that the guidelines draw is essentially how much do you need to do to get in? And if you don't need to expend significant sunk costs to get in the market, then we're going to call you an uncommitted entrant, and we're going to treat you as though you were already in. And I think that's what they did with Apple there. They said, look, Apple is just about there.
Right.
They haven't quite entered yet, but they have so little left to do. It's not very costly. And clearly they had strong evidence that Apple was committed to entering. Right? And so there you count Apple like a current market participant, and you say, we're not going to have the loss of competition from Google acquiring AdMob because there's this competitor called Apple, which we reasonably project is going to have a significant share in this business.
So is that or is that not an example of the potential competition doctrine being used successfully as a defense?
I wouldn't call it the potential competition doctrine, because I think that doctrine is dead. But I would say it is an example of using potential competition as a defense. And to flip it around, if it was Google buying Apple's business that was not yet in the market, I think that could have been challenged under the same theory Apple was used as a defense for.
But overall, you're saying like the balance is not correct right now for how potential competition is used?
Right now, there's a significant asymmetry. Right? The government is very worried, and they're appropriate to worry about future competition, but they are unwilling to recognize it as a defense as often as they should. I think if we could solve that asymmetry problem, we would have better enforcement policy.
So the Google AdMob decision is kind of an outlier then over the general trend?
Yeah, I mean, if you read the changes in the 2010 guidelines versus 92, if you read the commentary on the merger guidelines that was put out in 2006, you see a significant skepticism about the idea that dynamic response, be it committed or uncommitted entrant, could ever be recognized. I mean, there's almost hostility to it. I mean, it's surprising. I know from a litigation perspective, you don't want to open the door to these things, but guidelines are supposed to be a little bit more objective than that.
So when you were drafting the 1992 guidelines, Was potential competition a big part of those of that version of the guidelines?
Well, they were in the sense that we, for the first time, had this concept of uncommitted entrants. That we formalized in '92. It built on concepts that were in the '84 guidelines, but there was an entire section on potential competition mergers in the '84 guidelines that we didn't even bother to update. Instead, we refined these concepts of committed and uncommitted entry, and I think that's the better way to look at it.
And those sections are gone in the 2010
No,
guidelines?
they're still there.
Okay.
They're just not utilized in a symmetric way.
So there's been an ongoing debate about what the goal of antitrust should be, whether it should be consumer welfare, whether it should be protecting competition. What's your view on what the primary goal of antitrust should be?
It's protecting competition.
And what does that mean?
It's protecting a process that generates an efficient outcome. I don't think that we can pick who the winners and losers are. I think the best way to realize what I think is the flaw in the consumer welfare is that think about monopsony. So who's the consumer there? The consumer is the monopsonist, right? So are we protecting monopsonist welfare? I don't think that the proponents of consumer welfare would say that, okay? There they would be focused on economic welfare. So I think we should be protecting the competitive process that generates the economically efficient outcome.
So getting lowest prices for consumers is not the ultimate goal, in your opinion?
No, price is only one dimension of what a consumer gets. A consumer is getting a product that has quality dimensions. So consumer demand tells us what they want, and it's not always the lowest possible price because there quite often are product features that they want, and they're quite willing to pay for it.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today,
Thank
Paul.
you.
It's been a pleasure having you, and I hope we can do it again sometime soon.
I look forward to that.
Okay.